As we all know, Vincent Kennedy McMahon took the WWF and Hulk Hogan and brought both of them to brand new heights. However, what if he didn't? What if Vincent J. McMahon Sr. was the one to hold on to the company? Who would he have selected as his top guy? Well, that very question is the topic of this episode. Because today... Now, this question came up as the result of one of the Dave Knows Wrestling live streams. What's that? You're not familiar with the Dave Knows Wrestling live streams? Well, maybe that's because your notifications have to be set, as they do come on rather randomly, and also because being subscribed and being a member of the Know It All Nation is the only way you get to participate in the live chat. Plus, that also helps me to achieve my goal of getting that silver play button, which I really do appreciate. But speaking of people I appreciate, thank you to all my Patreon supporters such as Dakari Garmin and Rodney Harris. You really help to keep this channel going. Thank you. If you want your own Patreon shoutout and you want to participate in the Patreon polls, then please go over and sign up to my Patreon page. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into the episode. Okay, so under this hypothetical scenario, obviously enough, some things are going to be different than they were in real life. Namely, that Vince McMahon Jr. never got involved in the World Wrestling Federation. I don't know, maybe he became a real estate broker or something, doesn't matter. And in order to take our best guess at who Senior might pick as his top guy, well, it only makes sense to go back to the early 80s and determine who was available at the time. Meaning that we'll be looking at the WWF roster from 1980, 1981, and 1982. Since this is the time period where Junior would buy the company. And now that we've established those parameters, let's take a look at our first entry. Okay, so the first obvious question here is, why wouldn't Vince McMahon Sr. just go ahead and pick Hulk Hogan just as Jr. did? Well... Now, the primary reason why the Hulkster wouldn't have worked for Vinnie Mac Sr. is probably because, well, Vinnie Mac Prime already fired him. Vince McMahon Sr. was against Hulk Hogan appearing in the film Rocky III, even though that was the very film that would give him his superstardom. And as a result, Hulk Hogan would go to the AWA. He wouldn't return to the WWF if it wasn't for Vince McMahon Jr., who saw the star power and the potential in the Hulkster. And so, while Hulkamania ran wild, it's only because of that of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And while there is the possibility that Senior might have double clutched and desired Hogan to come back after the success of Rocky III, that probably wouldn't be much of an option, because back in those days, the golden rule was that you do not poach, you do not compete with other promotions, and this was a rule that was cherished by Vince McMahon Sr. And during this time, Hulk Hogan would be a member of the AWA, and so even though more than likely the Hulkster would end up still getting screwed by Nick Bockwinkel and would probably eventually be used down the line to just put over Greg Gagne, there would probably be a better chance of seeing Hulk Hogan go back to Japan rather than going back to the WWF if Senior was still in charge. Although, while we're talking about Hogan, we should keep in mind that there is a little something of the old guard that Vince McMahon Jr. decided to try and keep, at least temporarily, and that's the idea of the ethnic hero. But that leads me to... Okay, so the concept of the ethnic hero is something that I've tackled before in a previous episode. But in short, it's the idea that the WWF has a long-standing history of placating to specific demographics by giving them a top babyface that's of a specific background. Now, regardless to how you might feel about that strategy, it is one that Vinnie Mac Sr. did a lot, with Bob Backlund being a very rare exception. And so, if the OG was going to go back to his original formula, who's the man that he would pick? Well, he might just pick a Macho Man. The Macho Man Randy Savage received his famous kayfabe last name because it was said that someone who wrestles like a savage shouldn't have the last name of Poffo. However, when we take into account that Poffo is more of an ethnic sounding last name, maybe, just maybe, the Macho Man might have made it as the WWF top guy if Vince McMahon Sr. was in charge the whole time. Not only that, but in addition to being Italian American, the Macho Man was also part Jewish, resulting in yet another ethnicity that WWF could lean into if they decided to go with the route of the ethnic hero. However, the only caveat to this is that Macho Man Randy Savage didn't wrestle for the WWF until 1985, meaning that he was hired under the reign of Vincent Kennedy McMahon instead. As before this, Macho spent a lot of time wrestling in the Carolinas, in Georgia, and of course in Memphis, feuding particularly with the likes of Jerry Lawler. And while Savage may not have been completely happy playing second fiddle to that of Jerry the King, if there was no competition and no big WWF numbers to work with, there's a good chance that's all we might have gotten to know of the Macho Man. Alright, so this is now the second time that the whole no poaching rule has gotten to us, and with that being the case, maybe we need to just stick to the home team. and I might just have the perfect candidate for that. Okay, so now we have someone that could be built up as an ethnic hero, and furthermore, we also have someone that's been in the WWF for quite a while. Although, that might be part of the problem. The Polish Hammer Ivan Putski was obviously enough marketed for his ethnicity, and with the stunning physique that he had, it really would make a lot of sense to put him front and center as an ethnic hero for the WWF audience. However, while he was fairly popular, there are two major factors that we have to take into consideration. First, regardless of how built he was, we do have to remember that these muscles were only spread over a frame of 5 foot 7 inches tall, resulting in him being fairly short for a world champion. And while height is primarily known as a Vince McMahon thing, this is something that promoters across the board tend to look at. After all, it has been said that that's the reason why Bill Dundee never went further in his career either, and him and Putski are the same height. And the second thing we would have to think about is that of Putski's age. Even though he wouldn't retire for about another decade, we still have to remember that Putski's prime was just a few years prior to this time period. And while that doesn't mean that he still wouldn't have plenty of great matches in him, it does kind of make it hard to try and build a company around someone in the later stage of their career. And that's not to say that it's never happened, it's just not the most obvious strategy if you're going for, well, longevity. Although, it's still a good idea to have a somewhat established talent in the driver's seat of your promotion. Such as... While Snuka was only 2 years younger than that of Ivan Putski, he still remained a viable player well into the 90s, even getting to compete for the vacant Intercontinental title in a battle royal just a mere year and a half before Putski would be put into the WWF Hall of Fame. And furthermore to that, we also have to remember that Jimmy Snuka was immensely popular. He even got to be a part of the main event of the first WrestleMania, and he was also named as one of the main inspirations for a young Mick Foley to become a professional wrestler himself. Although, while he does hit a lot of the criteria on our list, he doesn't necessarily hit all of it in the exact way that we're looking for. While being from Fiji does indeed qualify him as ethnic, his background isn't necessarily the most prevalent in the New York area, and since at this time the WWF was still a territory, this might prevent the WWF from going all in on Snuka. Because we also have to remember how this whole territory thing really does affect how WWF is going to go forward as a brand. And since, again, it's not competing with anybody else, it really is focusing on a very specific market. Just something else that shows what a different world this would have been. Okay, so instead of one entry, let's try this approach with two. Either member of the Soul Patrol, Tony Atlas, or Rocky Johnson would be great fits for the role of the ethnic hero in the WWF. After all, upon winning the tag team championships, they became the first black champions in the promotion's history. And in addition, on a side note, as I'm sure many of you know, the first black WWE World Champion would be Rocky Johnson's son Dwayne, aka The Rock. However, even with all that being said, there are still two main factors that I think might keep both men out of the spotlight. Number one, in the case of Johnson, would again be his age. Although Tony Atlas, being 10 years younger, would have a different issue, as he admittedly had struggles with addiction around this time, which is the exact reason that a lot of people felt that he never got further in his career. Alright, here we go. So now, if we're going to look at someone who's going to be the biggest star in the WWF, well, let's just go for the biggest star. Hailed as the first truly international wrestling superstar and born in France, Andre the Giant was not only a megastar in the industry, but he was doing it as a wrestler for the WWF. And so, as he's already part of the territory that we're working with, and he's an immensely popular star, it would be hard to argue that Andre wouldn't be the guy that Vince McMahon Sr. would pick. Except if it wasn't for one small detail, or shall I say, a big one. As that Andre, despite his stardom, was for the most part treated as a special attraction. In short, when it comes to special attractions, they're used to draw in fans, and while they do make a lot of money and gain a lot of popularity, they usually get overlooked for titles, just as Haystacks Calhoun. The general thinking here is that the drawing power of a special attraction and the drawing power of a champion should be kept separate, because two candles burning are brighter than one. Okay, something else we have to factor in. But don't worry, we still have one more entry to go. While Tito Santana did wrestle for the American Wrestling Association and Georgia Championship Wrestling, and not to mention New Japan Pro Wrestling from 1980 to 1983, he first wrestled for the WWF in 1979. And so, while he did leave the promotion under Senior's watch, he did come back not long after, meaning that there is the possibility that he might have done so anyway, especially since he didn't stay with any of those other promotions for all that long. Now sure, we could say that if Vince McMahon Sr. really wanted him so badly, he wouldn't have let him go in the first place. But while that is a bit of a roadblock, let's remember just how over Tito Santana was back in the 80s. And on a side note, he was also the first person to hold the good design of the WWF Intercontinental title. The point is, Tito Santana fits the bill for every single thing that we're looking for. He's just slightly off on the timing. But if you can forgive that, then it's really hard to argue that Tito Santana wouldn't be the WWF's top guy, at least in this scenario. Well, there you go, some top contenders for the WWF top spot if Vince McMahon Jr. never took over control of the company. But who are some other names that you could think of? Let me know down in the comments. And also be sure that you're a member of the Know It All Nation by subscribing to this channel. Thanks to all my awesome Patreon supporters out there, and thank you for watching, and as always, Dave knows.